Hi, welcome to another Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness Scholar Talk. I am Tony Williams with the Bill of Rights Institute, a senior fellow with BRI, and we are very honored to welcome Professor Thomas Kidd, who wrote numerous pieces for Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness, but we're here to discuss his piece entitled Benjamin Franklin and the American Enlightenment. By way of introduction, Thomas Kidd is the Associate Director of the Institute for Studies of Religion and a Distinguished Professor of History at Baylor University. His books most recently include Who is an Evangelical? A History of a Movement in Crisis, and he has written extensively on early American colonial history, including Benjamin Franklin, The Religious Life of a Founding Father, American Colonial History, Clashing Cultures and Faiths, George Whitefield, America's Spiritual Founding Father, Patrick Henry, First Among Patriots, and I happen to have that right here, God of Liberty, A Religious History of the American Revolution, also pulled off my shelves today, and finally, The Great Awakening. Those are just a few of the books I pulled off my shelf, and you have others as well, and all marvelous. He has a PhD in history from the University of Notre Dame and received a bachelor's and master's degree from Clemson University, where my own daughter goes to college. So, Tommy, welcome very much, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, great. Well, why don't we just jump right in to the conversation? Now, we have a lot of teachers and students watching, and I was wondering if you can just provide some general historical context and explain what the Enlightenment was and what are some of its main ideas, particularly in the American context.
Right. So this is a really hotly debated issue among historians about the Enlightenment. And I mean, of books on the Enlightenment, there is no end. But in general, this is understood to be roughly kind of late 1600s to maybe early 1800s. And it's a time of a new emphasis on rationality, learning, science, the distribution of knowledge and education, and those kind of things. And one of the reasons why it's so hotly debated is because the term itself, Enlightenment, sort of presupposes a preceding era of dark times, which to some of the more extreme advocates of the Enlightenment would mean that you're switching from a time of faith, which is dark time, to a time of rationality, which is the light time. And you can see within that there's a certain kind of ideological component that has come along with parts of the study of the Enlightenment, especially an older generation that studied the Enlightenment, that a lot of historians think is a little too ideologically loaded. Seems like, some Christians in the past were in favor of learning, right? so that's one of the reasons why it's controversial. I mean, there's a lot of other reasons. The place of women in the Enlightenment has been a huge discussion in recent decades, and all kinds of things about the Enlightenment. But I think taking it with an appropriate grain of salt. I mean, I do think that there's something to the Enlightenment, that culturally things are changing in America and in Europe in the 1600s, 1700s. So that, sometimes I tell my students that, if you're living in 1700 in the colonies and your cow unexpectedly dies, which was, this is kind of an everyday occurrence, your thoughts are likely to turn to the possibility of malevolent forces having, being responsible for the demise of your cow. Where in 1800, even a regular person is a little less likely to think that way, and to think, well, there's medical reasons, biological reasons why my cow got sick. And so you tend to default to a more scientific kind of explanation for phenomena in the natural world. And I would say, to the extent that that's true, that change happens, we can attribute that to the Enlightenment, quote unquote.
Right, right. Okay, great. And so my next question would be more specific to Benjamin Franklin. He's obviously a printer early on, an entrepreneur, if you will. And so how does he achieve a lot of this early success once he moves to Philadelphia?
Right. So Franklin grew up in Boston, and he was in a Puritan family in Boston, and so grew up in a really intense religious environment. But his older brother was a printer, and so he was actually indentured to his older brother, which is kind of a horrible fate to be indentured. It basically, you're kind of forced into servitude. But it wasn't that uncommon for people of modest means to end up in some form of servitude. But it was a difficult situation, as you might guess, for Franklin. And he had a fraught relationship with his brother. And he actually ended up running away from Boston in early life, early adulthood, and trying to get out of a bad situation. But he had learned a lot about the print trade from his brother, and so he was able eventually to get set up in the print business in Philadelphia, working for printers in Philadelphia originally. Spent a little bit of time in London trying to get to learn more about the print trade and to get some printing equipment. And as usual with everything in those days, London was the center of the kind of the best of technology and printing and all those sorts of things. And so eventually he was able to come back to Philadelphia and set up his own printing business. And Franklin is characteristically known for being an entrepreneur and a scientist and all these, and it's all true. I mean, it's all the things that you've heard about Franklin along these lines are all true. Incredibly hardworking, innovative, ingenious, and so he was able to set up his print business in Philadelphia. And Franklin is also a genius of good timing and good luck, and so he was able to get a printing contract with the government of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, and that really set him on his way to being enormously successful in a very lucrative print business.
Right, right, and was the official government printer, if I'm not mistaken, right?
That's right.
I know, and the postmaster too. I meant, so it kind of helped.
Yeah,
as
that's
well.
right.
And so it becomes enormously successful, right? And we'll talk about how he's able to dedicate his life in a few minutes. But so, he's printing almanacs, Poor Richard's Almanac, and the Pennsylvania Gazette. And so how do newspapers and almanacs, pamphlets, books, how do they contribute to the American Enlightenment, right? Because as you point out in your essay, there's some relationship between literacy and learning and education and, sort of becoming a self-governing people. Building Republican self-government.
Right. So this is, part of an older story that goes back at least to, say, the Reformation. I mean, the Reformation is very much driven by print, and one of the things that print does is it, of course, allows for the greater dissemination of knowledge and learning and education and advancement in those areas for anybody who can gain access to those sorts of things. And so Franklin, grew up in a person of fairly modest means, but even when he was working for his brother in Boston, he, as a man with very little money, he was able to read all the books that they were publishing there in Boston and in Philadelphia. When he was working for other people, he would at night he would stay up late and read whatever he could get his hands on, and that is an illustration of, even for someone of relatively modest means, if they were literate, then you could get a hold of the latest learning and research and scholarship and controversies about theology and politics and all those sorts of things. And so the bounds of print and the print trade are expanding more and more during the era of the Enlightenment because of innovations in the print trade, and and print is becoming more and more inexpensive during this time. And so people like Franklin could be a beneficiary of that early in life, and then Franklin is able, as an author, to distribute his own work, so especially, most notably, his work on electricity, that goes through many different English language editions, but is also translated into many different languages in Europe. And so his ideas, for instance, about electricity, are being disseminated very quickly because of developments in the print trade. So print is, I guess, is a kind of lubricant to the spread of Enlightenment ideas, and so Franklin is a beneficiary of that, both as a relatively poor young man. Once he's able to get access to all these reading materials, then he's able to make a lot of money in the print trade, and then he's able to circulate his own ideas through the agency of the print trade. And so you can see at all those different levels and more that Franklin is a participant at all these different levels of the print trade, and then through the print trade to the broader Enlightenment.
Mm-hmm. Right, and its connection for Franklin and for others to that idea of self-government. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So once you have this kind of broader access, you might say democratization of print, then print, the public sphere is what print is kind of creating, is this sphere that's not under the control. If the government is not actively censoring, then the public sphere is kind of this third sphere, that is, it's not under the control of the government, it's not under the control of the church, but is this relatively independent intellectual sphere that, again, if you have access to print and you're literate, then you can participate in these things, and even if you're an indentured servant to your older brother, you theoretically can get access to knowledge about government, principles of government, authors like John Locke, which Franklin read at a fairly early stage in life. Franklin is an exceptional case in terms of this autodidactic kind of education. I mean, he has almost no formal education at all. I mean, he really spends about a year basically in school. But because of print, he's able to get access to these things and educate himself. Now, most people don't do what Franklin does. I mean, he's a voracious, driven reader and wanting access to knowledge. But if you are that way, like Franklin, because of the widespread availability of print, you can do that in new ways in the 1700s.
Okay, great. All right, and Franklin, while he was in Philadelphia and throughout his life, really became involved, participated in a number of civic activities to demonstrate his commitment to a healthy civil society, his commitment to civic virtue, and that vibrant kind of self-governing society, if you will. So can you talk about some of those activities and why Franklin thought it was important?
Well, Franklin was constantly thinking about those kinds of issues, about what we would call, civil society, and he was constantly thinking about the inculcation of virtue, and learning was certainly one of those virtues, but diligence and honesty and being concerned for your fellow man. And so once Franklin especially once he became what we would call independently wealthy because of his print work, really in a lot of ways, the whole rest of his life was devoted to those sorts of projects. But even before then, I mean, he gets involved when he's still a printer in Philadelphia. He's involved in the founding of what he calls the Junto, this group for, we would call it sort of a book club, but it was a little bit more ambitious, I think, than your average book club. I mean, it was artisans in Philadelphia, so that made it unusual. I mean, usually you would think about more elite aristocratic characters being involved with this sort of thing, but he wanted it to be for people, tradesmen in Philadelphia, for self-improvement and for philosophical political discussion, and for learning, just for being able to inform yourself and participate politically, and to improve yourself and to give yourself more networks and opportunities. And it was all kind of these entrepreneurial, but also virtuous projects, all kind of mashed together. They didn't want people arguing with each other about things like religion, but I mean, they would talk about religious topics, but they definitely didn't want it to be a debating society. They wanted it to be for mutual edification and virtue and improvement of the laws, and those are the kind of things that they were interested in talking about. And this was still a time when you didn't necessarily think of artisans participating. That this is kind of what we would call the working class people, and so this definitely is feeding into that kind of spirit of self-government and learning for all people, at least people like Franklin. There's many others that we could list. I mean, I think one of the most obvious ones after he experiences this kind of material success in the print business is the founding of the Library Company of Philadelphia, which was the first public lending library in America. Now, of course, many private individuals and colleges had libraries before that point. Harvard had its own library and those sorts of things. But Franklin's idea here was that even though the print business had become more widely available and disseminated and through cheap print up to that point, there were still a lot of books that one individual couldn't afford, especially artisans couldn't afford to buy. And I mean, with that, we are familiar with that sort of thing today. When you see the price of some academic titles, $80 or $100, who could possibly buy these things? And so Franklin's idea was that the library company would become a repository of as many books as possible, including relatively expensive books, and that it was a subscription library, and so people would pay a yearly subscription to get access to the library's holdings. But once you did, you could borrow these titles that would exceed the budget of most artisans, and so you could get access to the best learning that was available. And so this is the epitome of this kind of public spirited, Philadelphia, if it's going to be a great world city, it needs to have a lending library like that.
Okay, and what were the main ideas shaping Franklin's thinking about education and schools? He was involved in starting some, and so if you can talk a little bit about his involvement specifically in education.
Sure. I think John Locke, on so many issues, is the most formative influence on Franklin about education. And this is another instance where the Enlightenment influences people like, and Locke was kind of one of the early great writers of the English Enlightenment, and then he exercises such a huge influence on the American Enlightenment. A lot of optimism about the potential for education for a lot of people, not just the elites, but also a kind of a pragmatic streak about, a sense, Locke brings in a sense that Franklin adopts, that a lot of education is kind of, no pun intended, locked into these older forms of very classical and kind of rigid uh, forms of education. And not that they rejected that, but they wanted to have less of a dependence on Greek and Latin texts, and more of an emphasis on English texts. And this is again kind of trying to make education more widely available in vernacular languages. Of course, that's very much in the spirit of the Reformation. But so, it's not just this kind of enlightenment that's floating out there that's making this happen. It's also part of older Christian philosophies about education. And there is a turn away from strictly theological kind of education. It's not taken out. But Franklin is interested in an education that would not just be for pastors, because up to that point, the early 1700s, virtually all education in England and in America was for the training of pastors. And Yale, when it's founded in the early 1700s, is certainly thinking in terms of training congregational ministers. But Franklin wanted, again, he's happy to have an educated pastorate, and thinks that that's very important, but he wants all kinds of people to be able to have access to education, and not necessarily just for ministerial training. So, when Franklin is interested in founding what originally is called the Academy of Philadelphia, but then later turns into the College of Philadelphia, or the University of Pennsylvania, as it eventually became. I mean, Christianity is part of what he's emphasizing, because he thinks that education is first and foremost for the inculcation of virtue. And of course, Christianity has a major role to play in that. But unlike Harvard and Yale, or Oxford and Cambridge, the College of Philadelphia's philosophy of education, as sponsored by Franklin, is a step certainly in the direction of being more secular. But its aims don't seem very secular, because I mean they're definitely for the inculcation of virtue, and Christianity is going to play a role in fostering virtue. But he's not as keen about the kind of the exclusive role of teaching theology.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. And so how does Franklin then also participate in this international conversation of science, right? He becomes independently wealthy, as you said, and retires as his businesses continue he derives income from them. And he starts to sort of become a tinkerer and an experimenter, an innovator, maybe not a great theorist, but so how do his inventions impact society for the good? We've spoken a lot about that. And how do scientific inventions do that?
Right. So it's really amazing when you think about that Franklin is a major contributor in his time to three different fields: printing, and science, and diplomacy. And I mean, he's like, Einstein's Steve Jobs type level, I mean, contributor, in each of those fields. And so again, I'm pretty willing to give Franklin all the accolades that he's often given in American history, because he's just an extraordinary genius, and he's so ambitious, he's so diligent, he's so hardworking, and just doesn't have any kind of sense, in spite of his relatively modest background, in spite of his lack of education, he doesn't really have much of a sense of his own limitations. And so, as you said, he begins to make, in the 1730s and 40s, a phenomenal amount of money in printing, and that allows him to have the time and discretionary income to begin to fund scientific experiments, and the most significant of them, classically, of course, are his experiments in electricity. And without getting too far into the details on that, there was a dispute about exactly what lightning was in the scientific community, and he was participating by his own reading, but also an active correspondence with major figures, especially in London, about the nature of electricity and whether lightning. I mean, everybody thought lightning was some sort of fire. And he said, yeah, it is fire, but it's a kind of fire that can coexist with water. And so he wanted to demonstrate that lightning was a type of electricity. And so that leads to his experiment with the kite, and everybody knows the basic story with that. And he ends up writing that up, and other people are disseminating and publicizing it again through these kind of print networks, but also correspondence and just traveling people. I mean, he had people who really would do scientific demonstrations based on his work, and they would travel very widely, publicizing these things for a small fee. You could come watch these things. So entrepreneurship is part of the story as well. But that, to illustrate how widespread this was being disseminated. I mean, it was, as I said before, it was being published very widely. But that experiment with the kite really did, in his time, make him very famous. So famous, in fact, that there was a scientist, a German scientist who was living in Russia at the time, who heard about his kite experiment, and about a year later tried to replicate it in Russia.
So those are his views on science, and you've written a whole book on this, of course. But if you maybe in a nutshell for our viewers, what are his somewhat complicated views of religion?
Sure. Well, and all these things I've been talking about are connected to religion. I mean, he made a lot of his money in the print trade off of publicizing the First Great Awakening, and especially George Whitefield, who was the greatest evangelist of the mid-1700s, and a long-time friend of Franklin's. But their partnership really started as a business association, because Franklin was Whitefield's most important publicist in America. And so Franklin would publish Whitefield's sermons and his travel journals, but he would also publish anti-Whitefield material, and just all of it, whatever he could get, because he knew that Whitefield was just a moneymaker for him, and so that's part of the story. It's also Poor Richard's Almanacs and the Pennsylvania Gazette, but his religious publications are really important. And on the scientific experiments, I mean, people question the propriety of trying to control lightning, and as Franklin also, really probably his most practically significant invention was lightning rods, to draw off lightning and keep houses from being destroyed by fire created by lightning. But some people, were questioning whether this would even bring more judgment of God on people by trying to deprive God somehow, as if you can do that, of the ability to hit people with lightning. And so at every turn, some of his key conversation partners on his scientific experiments were sort of these pastor scientists, especially in England. But he grew up, as I said, in this Puritan environment, very intense commitment to Christianity and his parents' generation. But Franklin, as a teenager, began to develop sort of skeptical beliefs about his parents' traditional faith. But he could never get away from it completely, partly because even as a boy, he was so conversant with the King James Bible that he had a lot of it functionally memorized, and so in a way he does develop this skepticism, but he's so formed by the Bible and his parents' faith that he almost just by default keeps thinking in those kind of categories, and even talking, and even, I mean, some of his jokes were, Bible jokes. I mean, that's, he's a jokester all the time, but he would, for instance, show friends of his who he knew didn't know the Bible as well as he did. He would tell them about this story. He'd say, "Don't you remember this story from Genesis?" And he would tell them the story. And it wasn't from Genesis; it was just something he had made up. So by the end of his life, I mean, Franklin, he calls himself a deist in his autobiography. So that's not such a bad place to start about Franklin's personal beliefs. But he also believes in the providence of God, no question. He believes that God is active in human history and human affairs. And if you think, well, deists can't believe that, it turns out that Franklin and a lot of other people who called themselves deists believed in the providence of God. But there were key Christian doctrines that he just never seemed to be able to come around. The divinity of Christ, the Trinity, some things, things that Christians would consider to be, pretty basic to their faith. He just, at the end of his life, he just still couldn't quite get himself to believe. So skeptical, but that sort of umbrella of faith that his parents gave him just really deeply influenced his life and his thinking all the way to the end.
Right. So in many ways, really grappling with these, the relationship of science and religion really throughout his life.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Franklin would have just assumed that Christians should be interested in science, and many of the people that he's in conversation with, both through print and through correspondence, are more devout Christians than he is. And one of his key publicists about his scientific experiments was a former Baptist pastor in Philadelphia, who was still a very devout and traditional Baptist, but who was just fascinated with Franklin's scientific experiments. And so he said, this man, Ebenezer Kinnersley, set up kind of his own traveling show about Franklin's science. That was, Franklin wouldn't have thought that was unusual at all to have traditional Christians who were his friends and supporters. And so that this idea of the warfare between science and religion was just not, that wasn't really a thing in Franklin's time.
Right, good. Well, one final question, if you don't mind, just maybe a general, just kind of final conclusions about, how was Franklin really a representative of this early American Enlightenment, mid 18th century?
Yeah, I think that the American side of the Enlightenment, in contrast, especially to the French side of the Enlightenment, tends to be more moderate, more cautious. Of course, then the extreme versions of the French Revolution, I mean, they're just throwing everything out and lopping off heads, and we can recreate society right now and do it overnight. Franklin and people like him, on the American side, would not have been that extreme and radical, but sort of the slow, judicious pace of rationality, scientific inquiry, reading, dissemination of print. All these things are really, I think, kind of encapsulated in Franklin. I mean, Jefferson maybe is a competitor, but when you consider Franklin's enormous successes especially in publishing and in science, I think I would choose Franklin as the greatest exemplar of the American Enlightenment. And again, in contrast to the French Enlightenment, it's an Enlightenment that's generally pretty friendly to faith perspectives. Franklin and Jefferson are both skeptical about some basic Christian doctrines, but they both philosophically are very committed to the idea of virtue and public service, a strong civil society, and they understood that those things for typical Americans were encouraged and fostered by traditional faith. And so Even, Jefferson tended to be kind of a little harder edged in his anti-clerical views in particular, and he picked some of that up in France. But Franklin is just much more of an ironic character, self-effacing. And so even if he has these kind of doubts personally about the divinity of Christ and those sorts of things, he never would have taken a really harsh stance about that sort of thing. But his just an exceptional commitment to self-improvement, civil society, improving Philadelphia through the library and the junto, and we could talk about other, the Academy of Philadelphia, the first hospital in Philadelphia, and so forth. That combination of entrepreneurship and innovation and commitment to civil society, I think, is just the epitome of what the Enlightenment meant in America, and that's why I think that Franklin is its greatest advocate.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Thomas Kidd, for appearing today and for helping to discuss the American Enlightenment and specifically Benjamin Franklin for our viewers, particularly our teachers and students. And thank you for your great contributions to several essays to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Tony.
And all of the viewers can sign up for Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness, the Bill of Rights Institute's free online textbook at our website, billofrightsinstitute.org. Thank you for joining us.